I'm John Alger, president of James Madison University, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you here today to the Forbes Center Concert Hall. Today, we gather in this beautiful space for an event that's rather different than some of the traditional performances that have graced these walls since the Forbes Center opened 3 years ago. Today, we are beginning a new tradition while continuing a time-honored one. This new tradition is the Madison Vision Series. As you probably know, this series has been developed to advance the university's mission, to prepare students to be educated and enlightened citizens who lead productive and meaningful lives by looking at contemporary issues and challenges in an engaged society. These lectures will bring prominent speakers to our campus to explore our current civic landscape through the prism of creating an engaged and enlightened citizenry. Later this year, in fact, just a month from now, we'll be privileged to be joined by Dr. Carol Schneider, who's the president of the American Association of Colleges and Universities, so that's October 16th, the second lecture in the series. Cynthia Cooper, the former WorldCom vice president and whistleblower, will be with us in November. And in March, we will be joined by Jeffrey Rosen, the Chief Executive Officer of the National Constitution Center. And finally, in April, Carly Fiorina, the former CEO of Hewlett-Packard and a current member of JMU's Board of Visitors, will be with us. So we have some wonderful speakers coming up, and I urge you to come to all of those. Now, we begin this new tradition by accentuating a long-standing tradition here at James Madison University, and that is public discourse. Public discourse has indeed been a long tradition here, both in the classroom and across the campus. As reflected through programs such as the Madison Cup Debate Series or the Madison Collaborative, public discourse plays a key role in shaping us as individuals and as an institution of higher learning. In a note celebrating the idea of public education, James Madison wrote to a friend in 1822, "A popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both." To honor Madison the man and the conviction he expressed in this quotation, James Madison University presents the Madison Vision Series, Contemporary Issues in an Engaged Society. As an institution that links itself to President James Madison, it's essential that we lead this charge. And while that linkage has deep roots already in our history as an institution, today we are starting a new chapter. So on this, the 226th anniversary of the signing of the Constitution, we are privileged to bring together our past and our future. Our inaugural Madison Vision Series speaker, as well as our Constitution Day speaker, is Professor A.E. Dick Howard, the White Burkett Miller Professor of Law and Public Affairs from the University of Virginia School of Law. Professor Howard was awarded one of the first 3 honorary doctorates granted by James Madison University 30 years ago this past March, on the 75th anniversary of the founding of our university. He's here with us again today as we kick off this series. I'd especially like to welcome Dr. Howard's wife, Mary, and nephew, Thomas, as our guests this afternoon. We could not ask for a more distinguished or appropriate speaker for Constitution Day. Professor Howard served as the executive director of the commission that wrote Virginia's current Constitution and directed the successful referendum campaign for its ratification. He's been counsel to the General Assembly of Virginia and a consultant to state and federal bodies, including the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee. From 1982 to 1986, he served as counsel to the governor of Virginia, and he chaired Virginia's commission on the bicentennial of the U.S. Constitution. Following his time on that commission, Professor Howard was often called upon by constitutional draftsmen in other states and abroad to consult on their constitutions. He's helped to develop new constitutions in Brazil, Hong Kong, the Philippines, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Romania, Russia, Albania, Malawi, and South Africa. That's quite a list. You've traveled a lot, I see. It's fitting today that we reflect upon the global impact of our own founding document and the enduring principles for which it stands. In January of 1994, Washingtonian Magazine named Professor Howard as one of the most respected educators in the nation. And in 2007, the Richmond Times-Dispatch and the Library of Virginia included Professor Howard on their list of the greatest Virginians of the 20th century. So, please join me in welcoming to the Forbes Center stage, Professor Dick Howard.
Thank you, President Alger, for that gracious introduction, and my thanks to all of you for foregoing a stunningly beautiful afternoon in Harrisonburg. I mean, I got to thinking if I were an undergraduate at JMU and were presented between the choice of hearing some guy from Charlottesville talk and enjoying a beautiful day, I'm not sure which, hate to say what choice I would have made. Professor Alger, as you know, mentioned my teaching law at the University of Virginia. When I first joined the law faculty, that's the point at which I was asked to be the principal draftsman on Virginia's present Constitution, and that was a road that took me from the drafting stage to the legislative approval stage, and finally to directing the referendum campaign where I stumped the state talking about the state constitution. Little did I know at that time that that was a rehearsal, in effect, a prelude to working with other countries. I mean, I teach American constitutional law. It never occurred to me that I might sit at the elbows of draftsmen in places like Warsaw or Budapest or Prague and give them some advice on drafting their constitutions. And indeed, I was bound to ask myself the question, here I am an American. I carry the cultural baggage of an American constitutional law professor with all that which is implied. And so I was bound to ask myself, you know, what am I doing here? What possible advice can I give a Hungarian or a Pole or a Romanian on their constitutions? They have their own history, their own tradition, their own culture, and surely the American experience is simply too exceptional, simply too different. Its roots are in the Anglo-American constitutional tradition. We forged the compromise at Philadelphia. I mean, what use is all of that to people in those other countries? So that has put me in mind of the comments I want to make this afternoon, namely to raise the question with you, my Harrisonburg audience, what is it the American constitutional has to say to the world? Has it been used? Have other countries drawn upon it? What have they gotten out of it? I basically want to tell the story through several snapshots, several chapters, if you like, moments in world history, constitutional moments, if you like, in which I think the American experience has at least been on the table. So the first one I want to talk about is the revolutionary or founding era in France and America. It's hard to overemphasize what an exciting time it was in human history. There was an exuberance, an energy, and excitement about events on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, you understand that social and political conditions in France and America were really very different. I mean, we had no fully established church, though we had light establishments. We had no social orders of the kind they have in France. We had no centralized government of the kind that characterized France. So socially, we were very different places, but it's clear that the French were watching with fascination events in America. The French philosophers of the Enlightenment period who had been writing and talking and thinking about things like liberty and equality were actually seeing those things acted out on the American stage. Now, the conduit for American ideas in that day and time was often prominent Americans. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson come to mind. When Franklin stepped off the ship in France as our first American minister to Paris, he was already a world figure. Everybody knew about Ben and the experiment with the kites and the electricity. They knew about all his inventions. So he was a phenomenon from the moment he arrived. It happened that after this rather arduous voyage across the Atlantic, I think he was wearing a coonskin hat to sort of protect his head. And when he got to France, they thought all Americans dressed that way. So the coonskin cap became kind of suddenly a vogue item of apparel in the streets of Paris. He was really quite a figure. Franklin set out to try to carry American ideas to Paris. He saw to the publication, translation, and publication of the early American state constitutions, particularly that of Pennsylvania. It was about that time that the French National Assembly, being aware of American events, conferred honorary citizenship in France on James Madison, one of their first acts of that kind. Well, Thomas Jefferson then succeeded James Madison. Jefferson, he hated the cold winters in Paris, but as you probably know, he loved the French way of life, French wine and the like. He was very popular at dinner tables in France and the salons of French intellectuals. And he, like Franklin, thought it was part of his mission to bring France to understand what was happening in America. For example, as you know, he was the architect of the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty. And he saw to its publication, translation and publication in the French Encyclopedia. Now, I think the general effect of American events in France at that time was the sense of the dawn of a new era, that this was something that humankind had never seen before, that finally the Americans were proving that self-government by a free people was in fact possible. Now, this finally evolved into a debate over the form of government. Famous exchange of views between French philosophers like Turgot, Americans like John Adams, a back and forth on, for example, whether bicameralism or unicameralism were the best forms of government. Perhaps the most tangible example that I can give of an American idea that took root in France would be to mention France's Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen, the 1789 document. If you lay that side by side with George Mason's Declaration of Rights for Virginia, 1776, the similarities are striking. And indeed, historians have probed the way in which the Virginia document made its way to Paris, was used by drafters like Lafayette and others. So the congruence of thinking about rights had some similarity in both countries. Now, the striking difference comes when you look at the structure of government. When the French National Assembly in the 1790s set to work on France's first constitution, first frame of government, 1791, they debated the differences between the American state constitutions. The radical faction in Paris liked the Pennsylvania Constitution because it was radically democratic. The more moderate faction liked the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, which was more of a balanced separation of powers kind of document. That debate was resolved finally in favor of the more radical approach, the French philosophy being that you focus power in the National Assembly. Now, as you know, American government has gone in a very different direction. Part of the Madisonian compromise at Philadelphia with his fellow delegates produced separation of power, checks and balances, and federalism, something very different from what the French crafted in the 1790s. So I would argue that most of the world's constitutional history from the 1790s involves at some level a choice between that American model and that French model. So despite that divergence, what I find intriguing in terms of this afternoon's topic is the extent to which what was happening in America framed the debate, that whether they accepted or rejected what Americans were doing, they used the American experience to frame what they were doing in France. Now that was the founding period. My second snapshot is a period that Americans don't talk about very much, the revolutions of 1848. But in the European consciousness, that is a powerfully important historical moment. It really, in many ways, was the foundation of much of what's happened in Europe since that time. Revolutions broke out in France, in Germany, in Hungary, a number of other places. And in France, we had sort of an interesting replay of the debates that I just mentioned in the 1790s. And once again, the French came down on the side of unicameralism. What I find especially striking is the debates that took place in Germany. There was an election to a parliament at Frankfurt, at the Paulskirche Church in Frankfurt, at which the liberals formed most of the delegates. Indeed, most of the delegates, you professors here will like this, most of the delegates were academics, right? As if they were the ones one should entrust with the writing of a constitution. And many of the academics were in fact law professors. And the two issues that were uppermost in the minds of the German delegates were federalism and judicial review. It's fascinating to read the debates at the Paulskirche, 1848, 1849, and here the delegates draw upon and use as illustrations American experience. Federalism, for example, Germany had had some experience of a sort of loosely federal arrangement, but they were quite impressed by what Americans had done to make federalism actually work. The German delegates were very well read. There was one German professor, Karl Mittermeier. He was a distinguished scholar, had honorary degrees from American universities, and he said, here's what he said. He said, read the American Constitution in the usual bad translations and compare it to the living Constitution. It owes its vitality, its vigor to the Supreme Court. I ask you, gentlemen, to turn to the experience of America. Let us follow their example, and we shall harvest the most splendid fruits. So when the German delegates turned to thinking about courts and judicial review, it's quite striking that this Constitution they drafted, which in fact did not go into effect, but it would have created a high court, a constitutional court, with powers to strike down active legislature. And as you know, if you studied James Madison and that period, and John Marshall's decision in Marbury versus Madison, you know that judicial review, the power to strike down legislative acts, is a key component of American constitutionalism. It is a device that was largely unknown to the European scene until after World War II. It's now begun to take hold. But back in the early 19th century, it was a phenomenon that was peculiarly American, and yet here were the Germans proposing to do it in Germany. As it happened, the conservative powers, Prussia and Austria in particular, snuffed out the Frankfurt Constitution. But its legacy remained because if you look at today's German Basic Law of 1949, you see principles that clearly derive from that document back in 1848. My third snapshot is, now we fast forward into the 20th century, into America's colonial period. You know, you don't generally think of America as a colonial power. We think the French and the British and the Spaniards and Portuguese did colonies, but that's not the American way. Well, we did have an important colony in the Philippines. After America won the Spanish-American War, the question then was, what should we do with the Philippines? Puerto Rico, you know that story. But what about the Philippines? There were the anti-imperialists. They were people like William James and William Jennings Bryan. They said, imperialism is not part of the American tradition. We do not colonize other peoples, and we ought to simply turn the Philippines over to the Filipino people, let them run their own affairs. On the other side, you had imperialists or expansionists, some of whom argued that we ought to keep the Philippines for commercial purposes, for military purposes, to have naval bases and the like. But the most striking argument for staying in the Philippines was essentially a kind of evangelical argument, if you like, and that was that America owed a kind of spiritual or moral duty to the Filipinos to sort of bring them up to the level of American life. Here's what Senator Albert Beveridge said in 1898. American law, American order, American civilization, and the American flag will plant themselves on shores hitherto bloody and benighted. God has marked us as his chosen people, henceforth to lead in the regeneration of the world. How about that for an expansive point of view of the regeneration of the world? Another name for it would be manifest destiny, that that we owed other people that moral duty. There was a process, President McKinley, William Howard Taft, and others began the process of what I would call the Americanization of the Philippines. That Taft used a phrase that today would strike you as peculiarly incorrect, but he talked about the Filipinos as our little brown brothers. Well, 100 years ago, that was perhaps a comfortable phrase. We might think differently today. But to give the people of 100 years ago credit, they weren't simply going to stay in the Philippines and exploit its resources. They did have this notion that America should begin the process of moving the Philippines towards some kind of self-government. Now, the Filipinos, I have to say, had other ideas about that. There was a very nasty civil war because they thought we were going to whip the Spaniards and then leave, and we stayed, and they weren't too pleased about that. This Americanization program, as I called it, had three parts. One was moving the Philippines towards self-government, beginning at the local council level and then gradually moving up to the National Assembly, a gradual expansion of the franchise. Second component will be of special interest to James Madison University, given its genesis in earlier days as a teacher's college, and that is education. The notion was that Filipino schools would look more like American schools. I've looked at textbooks that were printed for the Philippines in those days, and they are really like American textbooks. They're full of sort of stories about self-reliance and hard work and honesty and all the values that one would like to inculcate in lower school students. So you had civics lessons in the Philippine schools that were very much American in origin. Thirdly, there was a transfer of American jurisprudence, that American laws and procedural codes were imported to the Philippines, American judges were present in Filipino courts, and indeed, if your president or I argued a case in the Supreme Court of the Philippines in those days, we could cite American Supreme Court cases as precedent, and they would be fully binding upon the Filipino Supreme Court. Well, again, to give credit to the people of that day and time, they put the Philippines on the process finally of writing a constitution. There were certain metes and bounds, limits placed upon what they could do, but they were allowed to do it, and the idea was independence. I think in 1944, that was delayed a little bit, obviously by World War II. But the Constitution they wrote has strong American imprints on it. It is a presidential system. It does have constitutional supremacy, not parliamentary supremacy. It does have judicial review. So I think that's one area, for better or for worse, that American constitutionalism clearly was very much part of the conversation. Next snapshot is the age of Woodrow Wilson. I mean, anybody who's read about or heard about Wilson remembers the famous phrase that Wilson saw World War I as the occasion to make the world, as he put it, safe for democracy. Wilson was, as you may know, a constitutional law professor at Princeton before he became Princeton's president, governor of New Jersey, and the U.S. president. And his thinking about post-World War I constitutions in Europe was not that they should imitate the American Constitution. Indeed, I think he was more concerned about self-determination and democracy than he was about what we would call constitutionalism. So the post-World War I constitutions of Europe, for the most part, met Wilson's general requirements of popular representation, an administration subject to the law, an independent judiciary, and a Bill of Rights. An interesting story in particular is the story of Thomas Masaryk and modern Czechoslovakia. Until World War II, what became Czechoslovakia was simply a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and political leaders in those lands wanted independence. But Wilson at one point was inclined to think maybe you could keep the Austro-Hungarian Empire in place but simply have a fair degree of autonomy for its constituent parts. That was not enough for Thomas Masaryk and the other Czech and Slovak leaders. Masaryk actually had lived in this country, knew American culture very well, and he understood his audience. He actually went to work on Wilson to sort of bring him to think of Czech and Slovak ambitions as being like American ambitions at the time of our Declaration of Independence. It started in, of all unlikely places, Pittsburgh. I don't know if anybody here from Pittsburgh or not. No, apparently not. But if you were, you'd want to know that the Pittsburgh Declaration of 1918 was the beginning of the road to Czech and Slovak independence. The Declaration of Independence for Czechoslovakia was then written not in Prague, but in Washington. In fact, the first draft was in English, and it's full of Lincoln-esque kind of phrases, and it's clear that Masaryk and his colleagues were playing upon American public sentiment to see the Czechs and Slovaks as being a bit more like us. Well, it's interesting. I mean, he brought Wilson around. Wilson finally came out for Czech and Slovak independence, and Czechoslovakia came into being. But if you read the first post-war Czech constitution, it doesn't feel or look very American. It feels very European. So I think the work of American influence was largely done before that moment. Next snapshot, we're moving quickly into the modern era, Japan and Germany after World War II. There was what was called the Potsdam Declaration, 1945, which called for the unconditional surrender of Japan and called for Japan to establish a democratic government with respect for human rights before the Allied forces would finally withdraw. General MacArthur was the shogun of Tokyo. He was the supreme Allied commander. And when he was in Tokyo, one of his concerns was to see a new Japanese constitution written. And it was thought that the Japanese would bring one into being. The Japanese government stayed in place, unlike Germany after World War II. And so the Japanese went to work on a constitution, but word leaked out. Finally, MacArthur realized all they were going to do was tinker with the old pre-war constitution, the one they had actually modeled on the Prussian Constitution of 1885. And MacArthur knew that wasn't going to be enough, and the Japanese were not getting the job done. He was worried that unless they moved the show along, that the Russians would get involved. And then you'd have the problem in Japan of carving up Japan the way Germany had been carved up after World War II. So MacArthur turned to his military government team and said, I want a constitution. Well, I served in the Army, and I'm sure if I'd served under General MacArthur, and he said, write me a constitution, I would say, how soon do you want it? Yes, sir, I'll have it on your desk in the morning. Well, the military government team took them 7 days. Think about Philadelphia and several months to write our Constitution. Think about writing a Constitution in 7 days. But that's, as I say, that was MacArthur's way of doing things. Well, the Japanese were appalled because they thought they were going to get to do the job. And here's this Constitution is being presented to them by the American military government. And it was very much a New Deal era Constitution. It had a lot of ideas that even our Constitution doesn't have. It had women's rights in there, for example, something ahead of its time for 1946. Labor unions were protected, liberalized economy and the like, and some notions about positive rights. So we got a new Constitution in place thanks to MacArthur, and it's a remarkable document. As a kind of compromise, they retained the emperor. They thought that they needed that sense of connection with Japanese ways. But the most famous part of it is Article 9, the peace provision that renounces war and renounces defensive forces. It has fundamental rights. It has judicial review. Marbury versus Madison makes its appearance. Well, when that Constitution went into place in 1946 and the Americans finally withdrew, you would have imagined that at some point the Japanese would say, fine, the Americans are out of here, let's write our own Constitution. It didn't happen. The Japanese Constitution that is presently in full force and effect is the same document that was drafted and adopted in 1946. It has never been amended. And you're bound to stop and say, well, wait a minute. Why would the Japanese keep in place this American document? The answer, I'm not a student of Japanese culture, but the answer has to be that the Japanese have made it Japanese through practice and convention. This is the living Constitution at work, that they have interpreted, applied it, used it in a way that it becomes part of their culture, whatever its original drafting might have been. So I think in that sense, their story is not unlike the what you might call the living constitution in this country. Germany's story is a little bit different because the Japanese constitution was written, as I say, in 1946. The German drafting took place a little bit later, and the critical intervening event was the events of 1948. The fall of Czechoslovakia into communist hands, the Berlin blockade, the Berlin airlift, the Korean War was just around the corner in 1950. The Cold War had begun. Suddenly we were turning from our Axis enemies of World War II to confrontation with the communist empire. It was the era that Harry Truman called for containment. George C. Marshall and the others were at work with the Marshall Plan. The world had changed fundamentally, and the Germans knew it. So the Germans understood that America now saw Germany as a potential bulwark against communist expansion, which of course gave the German drafters of their post-war constitution far more bargaining power than the Japanese had in Tokyo. And so the Allies would make demands on the Germans, and the German leaders would sort of be careful enough, nimble enough to sort of deflect some of those demands. The result is that the so-called German Basic Law of 1949 is much more authentically a German document than the Japanese Constitution of 1946 was Japanese. And but this is another case where I think American influence is present, though not always understood. And that is the 1949 Basic Law drew, as I've commented on the principles of that 1848 Paulskirche Constitution. In turn, the German Constitution, which has a strong constitutional court, it has constitutional supremacy, it has federalism, it has recognizable features from our standpoint. It in turn has proved to be one of the world's most influential constitutions. The South Africans drew heavily on the German model. The post-communist countries of Central and Eastern Europe after 1989 drew upon the German model. So to the extent that we influenced 1848, which influenced 1949, which influenced these new democracies, you see the lingering influence of some fundamental American principles. Now, the post-World War II period is a period where international law really makes its appearance. Any drafter today of a national constitution cannot ignore international norms, conventions, treaties, and the like. The United Nations Charter, the Covenant of Human Rights, other UN documents have been very important as sources of drafting in the post-World War II period. The last snapshot that I want to lay before you is an area where my students think I worked in some of those earlier periods, but actually I haven't been around that long. But I missed some of those episodes. I was not with Madison at Philadelphia, whatever the conventional wisdom may be. But I did have the chance to sit at the elbows of some drafters in post-communist Europe. This is after the Berlin Wall came down. And the State Department asked me if I would meet with some Hungarians, drafters who came over. They came down to Charlottesville. We spent a couple of days doing a seminar, in effect, on what do you do when you write a constitution. They then invited me to Budapest, and I worked with some of the drafters over there and found myself in some of the other capitals of the region of Warsaw and Prague and other places. And I was quite fascinated to actually see these drafters at work. I mean, think about a part of the world which had been under communist control from the 1940s to the end of the 1980s, a couple of generations' time. Before that was the Nazi period, World War II. And before that, most of those countries, save Czechoslovakia, had never had any democratic experience. I mean, in Romania, for example, democracy was a totally alien experience for them. So you had that long period of lack of acquaintance. You then had the overlay of the communist system itself. And I've traveled some in these countries before the Berlin Wall came down, and it's hard to overemphasize the stifling effect of communism, that the Communist Party, when they took over a country, set out to destroy completely the foundations of civic democracy. All intermediate bodies, trade unions or churches or any other group had to be subservient to the party or simply be wiped out. was nothing standing between the party's will and the individual. The result was a totally corrupt system where the rule of law was a joke, that what you got as a citizen depended on who you knew, deals under the table. They talked about telephone justice. The procurator would call the judge and simply tell him how to decide a case. It sort of makes a joke of the rule of law. I remember being in Moscow and Leningrad, what had been Leningrad, soon after the Berlin Wall came down, meeting with some drafters of the first post-communist Russian constitution, and we were working through translators. I don't speak Russian, and this translator was very good and trying to do an honest job, but we learned that she was translating the English phrase rule of law as socialist legality. Well, we had to see, no, that's not really quite what we mean. It's a little bit different from that. But you see the impact, the imprint culture makes, history and tradition under that communist era. So you can't do a sudden 180-degree turn and wipe away that experience, even though the leaders of those countries after '89 were aspiring to constitutional democracy. It's not going to just suddenly flare into life in a moment. So there was an enormous burden of history to overcome, cynicism about law and institutions. There was, on the positive side, in particular, the draw of Western Europe. The Eastern Europeans saw themselves as having been wrenched from the family of Europe by World War II and then by the communist period. So they did have the strong influence of countries like Germany, the United Kingdom, and others. Which brings me to the question that I basically have been trying to track through all of these historical episodes, namely, where does the American experience belong in all of this? Now, there are different views of that. I do have academic colleagues who say that American exceptionalism is such that basically the American experience has no place. There really isn't much to tell other people. That's one side of it. Then on the other side, I ran into lawyers in airports in the post-'89 period that would sort of say, aha, you want to write a constitution? I've got one right here in my pocket. We the people of, fill in the space, and just go on and copy it out. Well, that was a crazy idea from the beginning. Among the arguments that you'd hear against the relevance of the American experience, first, that there are no universals. Now, this is sort of like the argument against human rights. You hear the Chinese government, for example, or some of the authoritarian states in the world to say, oh, human rights is a Western invention. It's cultural imperialism. Well, one may fairly debate that. I happen to think the human condition invites certain universals, whatever those might be. I think you can apply that to constitutions as well. A second argument against the relevance of the American experience is exceptionalism, that our whole system evolved over centuries of Anglo-American development going back to Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights and beyond, and that simply can't be replicated elsewhere. A third argument is just look at the text of the Constitution. It's short, a few thousand words, mercifully short, a quick read, and it's an 18th century document written by people who were living at a time before the modern welfare state came into being. The administrative state that we're familiar with simply didn't exist. Government was assumed in those days to have limited functions. Indeed, in many ways, think about the place of the federal Constitution in the American system. It is by design an incomplete document. And I say by design incomplete. Why? Because it assumes the existence of the states and their constitutions. I mean, my work with the Virginia Constitution, for me at least, drove that point home. The framers of the federal document understood they were not wiping out the states, that most people would live their daily lives under state governments and state constitutions. And in a sense, to get the full picture of American constitutionalism, you have to take the United States Constitution and the state constitutions and put them together. Once again, it's argued that that incomplete nature of our constitutional document makes it an unsuited model for other countries. And finally, there's the argument that the federal constitution is really about process, structure, institution, whereas most modern constitutions have a great deal to say about the outcome of policy, for example, in social and economic matters. Well, all those are fairly formidable arguments. I could just wrap it up and quit at that point and say, fine, I guess we're convinced that the American experience really is not very relevant. I think the relevance of our constitutional insights does not lie in the text of the document, the notion that you can sit down the way you would draw up a will or a deed and just copy it out of a form book. Constitutions are not like that. The relevance, I think, lies when you put on the hat of James Madison and you burrow into the fundamental principles, the ideas that underlie, that make the Constitution what it is. Read the Federalist Papers. It's a hard read, but it's probably the most creative contribution anyone has made to American political theory. If you work your way through that, you begin to see the architecture of American constitutionalism, the principles that I'm talking about. And so my approach when I've been working with foreign drafters is not to hold our Constitution out as a model, but simply to ask a lot of questions, raise some issues, and say, might there be certain fundamental principles that any Constitution maker presumptively should take into account, and then decide whether it works for that country, and if so, how they want to actually put it into structure. I'm thinking, for example, of American federalism. And surely your instinct is, well, that is a peculiar American arrangement for Americans by Americans, and that can't have any relevance elsewhere. But if you think about the point of federalism is to adjust the boundaries in some often awkward way, but to sort of realize there are decisions at the center and decisions at local levels, and that there's a proper place for both. Each has its place, and in a way they act as counterpoints to each other. Tocqueville recognized that in his work on American democracy. So transporting that idea, it may not turn out to be federalism in the formal juridical sense, but it may be subsidiarity, it may be devolution, there are lots of names for it, but the underlying principle is the same, namely, there is a place for local decisions by local people in a system which is otherwise centralized. Second example, judicial review. Judicial review is, I think, in many ways, one of the most distinctive American contributions to constitutional theory. But once again, it doesn't have to be that another country will recognize Marbury versus Madison. Their high court doesn't have to look like our Supreme Court. In Europe, for example, they have constitutional courts, which are really a separate branch entirely, independent of the ordinary judiciary. The point is not quite precisely how you do it. The point is recognizing the underlying principle, in this case, constitutional supremacy. In my judgment, judicial review is not a bad way to make that work. The point is the Constitution can't be an ordinary law. It's not just another statute. It's got to be recognized in some respect as fundamental law, which is over and above ordinary law. Now, there are other countries that have adjusted the boundaries of judicial review in ways that don't look like Marbury, but again, the underlying principle is the same. One more example, separation of powers and checks and balances. Most countries have 3 branches the way we do. Some countries, Oriental countries, for example, have 5 branches. The point is not, again, the precise box and string chart of how the government operates. It's recognizing that something like separation of powers coupled with checks and balances is a way of sort of ameliorating or weaning power. I think our framers recognize that unless you have some way of power confronting power, Madison famously talking about faction, how you set faction against faction, the idea of contending forces fragmenting concentrated power. Once again, there are lots of ways to do it, but I think the underlying principle is valid. Coupled finally with that is something that's much more less obvious, it's more mundane, it's more grassroots, and that is, in addition to grand principle and the sort of ideas I've been talking about, there's everyday experience of making constitutions work. And I found that For example, in the post-communist countries, the most valuable lessons that Americans could take to their European counterparts was just the day-to-day operation of constitutional government. An independent bar, independent judiciary, how parliaments work, a free press. I mean, all this sort of nuts and bolts of even city councils and how local governments work, that sort of thing is a valuable lesson. And finally, at the base of all that, I mean, if I had to search for one thing that makes constitutional government work, to make it valid, to make it a reality, I would talk about civic education. It seems to me the inculcation in the ordinary people of a country of they may not talk about it as constitutional law, that may be lawyers talk, but for them to understand what it means to be a citizen of a constitutional democracy. Something as basic as fighting an election, being on the losing side, stepping aside and accepting that the other guy won, and then fighting the next election. That's not a universal principle by any means, but that to me is part of what civic education is about. That brings me right back to what's happening here at James Madison University and other universities, I hope, throughout the country. Namely, when you're studying, it may not be a course in political science, it may be some other course, but if you're sort of beginning to internalize the lessons of civic education, how do you resolve the tension between accountable government where people make the decisions with constitutional limitations? I mean, there's a lot of tension there inherently making those, and yet both of them are fundamental propositions which we should care about. So instilling the values of citizenship, things like tolerance and patience and understanding and dialogue and restraint, qualities which we often see missing in today's public life, I think we will agree. But those are the things that make constitutional government work. This brings me right back at the conclusion to a Virginian and a Virginia statement. Now, I suppose if I were lecturing in Boston, I'd come back to John Adams, right? New York, I'd quote Alexander Hamilton. I am permitted here in Harrisonburg to quote a Virginian to wrap these remarks. And it won't be Thomas Jefferson, by the way. Gotcha, didn't I? You thought, here's this UVA guy, he's going to give me, I've heard so many Jefferson quotes, and this guy's going to quote Jefferson again. It's actually written into my contract that I have to quote Jefferson at least once in every public lecture. But this one is George Mason, whose name has been given to another public institution in Virginia. Virginia's Declaration of Rights, I mentioned that a moment ago, still in Virginia's Constitution is Article 1 of our present Virginia Constitution. And along with all the statements you would expect of free speech, free exercise of religion, and the like, there's a lovely passage. Mason wrote it. It was true in his time. I think it's true today. He said, and I quote, that no free government nor the blessings of liberty can be preserved to any people save by a frequent recurrence to fundamental principles. I love that line, a frequent recurrence to fundamental principles. If we can do that, I think constitutional government is alive and well. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Wow, Professor Howard, thank you so much for that talk. It was a perfect way to launch our Vision Series and to celebrate Constitution Day. And I hope all of us have had a chance here to think about the impact of the work that you have done with colleagues all over the country and all over the world in helping people to think about these very important issues of governance that will affect not just our generation, but many generations to come. What an incredible gift you've given with your skills and your talents. So thank you so much for the work that you've done. On behalf of James Madison University, I'd like to present you with this small token of our appreciation. We hope it will help you to remember this day, a very special day for us as we launch this lecture series. And again, what a perfect way to start with you here to celebrate with you the values of our Constitution and its continuing relevance in our country and the world. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.